Hi everyone, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here for the last day of our week-long Winter Wonderland video series featuring Penny Black's newest scenic stamps. And here's a look at the stamp that we will be featuring today, 40-880 Panorama, or Panorama, and a look at each of the cards that we will be creating. As with all the videos in this video series, each video features two cards with the same stamp, one technique using no painting and the second technique using more layers and artsy watercolor techniques. So let's start off with this very first clean and simple card design that doesn't require any painting at all. I am stamping in my MISTI stamp positioning tool onto Strathmore Bristol smooth paper, and I am inking up my stamp using Ranger Archival inks. And I am just working section by section, putting the ink on the areas where I want only that color. And if I get the ink on areas where I don't want that, I just wipe it off with my fingertip from those areas where it should not be before I stamp. If you don't want to use your finger, you can use a paper towel to wipe that off. I find for both of the techniques that I'm doing, the Bristol smooth paper makes all the difference. It really captures the detail of the stamps, and for the second technique makes it very easy to blend. As always, down in the YouTube description box you will find a complete listing of all the supplies I'm using: inks, markers, papers, paint, colors, everything. And of course the Penny Black stamps and dies will be listed and linked to our online store down in that YouTube description box as well. You can see I started with the light blue and layered up some darker blue, and now I'm moving on to some gray for those trees. Now it does get a little tricky there where the sort of far off distance background trees are right next to those foreground trees, so just check with your fingertip before you stamp that there isn't any on areas that you don't want it. I love using these mini ink pads because you can kind of turn them on their side and just use the edge of it to really position that ink where you want it to go. Here I'm moving in and getting those trees in the background. I'm doing a couple of layers just to darken things up a little bit. But you can see just like that, the entire scene is really coming to life. I love how with Penny Black scenic stamps, they really build in for you that depth and perspective, depending on smaller things in the background, roads sort of moving towards that vanishing point, and that just makes things look really nice without you having to do any of the thinking about that. So after I stamped those trees, I decided I wanted them a little bit darker, so I can just go right in with a darker color right on top. And for this little area right up next to those birch trees in the front, I've grabbed a Tombow dual brush pen just to color directly onto the stamp. That lets me get the ink just exactly where I want it to be using that tip of the marker. Whenever you color directly onto your stamps, you want to use a water-based marker to do that. And that is as simple as the stamping is for that first card. I went ahead and layered it up with some of our creative dies. I've used our Stitch Circles die as well as our new Winter Stems die with that little branch on the right hand side. And then a must have if you're doing some scenic stamping and you like to add a little bird to all these beautiful trees is our Nestlings creative die set. Get a couple sizes of birds. You can put them facing each other or just use one bird. And our sentiment on this card comes from the Feeling of Christmas new transparent set. So I just layered those, spotlighted one part of the scene that was stamped, and the clean and simple card is complete. Here's a look at that entire card. It's a standard A2 size card, 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. So now we'll move on to the second technique. This adds a bit of watercoloring and some stamp layering for an artsy but very doable finished card. And this also shows sort of the versatility of these stamps, that you can get the most from them by switching up your color schemes or adding different layers or only using certain parts of the stamp. So when you're purchasing these stamps, say you just wanted some birch trees, you could just ink up and stamp these birch trees and use just that part of the stamp and combine it with others, or keep it very simple to create your own scenes. So you're really getting a lot just in one stamp. Now for this card, because I am adding some watercolor and I want to have a really painted look, I am stamping using water-soluble ink pads. Of course, the markers I'll be using are also water-soluble, but the ink pads I'm using are Distress inks. And what that does is it allows me to stamp it onto my paper. Then I have a paintbrush handy and just a cup of plain water. I dip that paintbrush in the water, dab it off onto the paper towel, and then move to the paper to blend that ink a little bit and give it that soft watercolor look. You can see I first stamped with the ink pad for these trees, then I went in and added just a little bit of darker color on there using the marker, and wow, you can really see these start to come to life. I love these birches. They're really easy to do and you get a really nice effect when you do them just with a couple of colors. So I'm just going to continue to ink and stamp and play around until I'm happy with this. You can see there though, just using those birches would make a beautiful card. And so you can play around with the different layers on your card design. So I am going to go ahead here and get a bit of the ground, which I am inking with my Distress Ink mini ink pad. I will stamp that and then go in and blend that with water. I do like to work section by section. I think it makes it a little bit easier to blend before that ink sort of absorbs a little bit more into the paper. I'm going to add a little touch of blue here along sort of the ground line there, which I will then blend out to create a bit of a shadow. And then I will darken up that just a little bit and blend it some more. Just wanted that a little bit darker. And I'm just deciding here what color to grab next. So I decided to go ahead and use my markers on these trees. I'm kind of turning the marker to the side so I can apply the ink pretty evenly across those trees in the background. It's handy to use the marker on those just to get in between, especially where they meet the birches. And I put a light color down first and then a little bit darker color and stamp that down, and then I'm just grabbing my paintbrush to blend that out, give it a really loose, soft watercolor look. And then I am going to add a touch of Distress ink, just turning that ink pad, mini ink pad on its side and using the corner. And I'm actually going to stamp that down while it's still a little bit wet. That will help it sort of blend a little bit on its own, and I'm helping it out also using my paintbrush and a little bit of water. And just because I can, I'm adding even more color onto the trees. I love to add lots of layers. And all of the colors that I'm using, the papers, the stamps, everything, all the supplies are listed for you down in that YouTube description box below. So now I wanted to add another layer. Now this is an older stamp of ours, but it's an oldie but a goodie. This is 40-270 City Lights. And if you haven't seen one of our designers, Mimi a la carte, she does a lot of beautiful winter scenes with the city in the background. So I was definitely inspired by her. I put my Distress ink onto the stamp, the darker color up at the top, and you can see I'm just rubbing with my finger the base of that city, so that's not even going to stamp. I'm just getting that top part, and then I'm going to go in with that paintbrush and just water and blend that down. So I didn't need to mask my trees or anything. I just rubbed off a little bit of that ink before stamping it. So like I said, Mimi does a lot of cards with these beautiful city scenes, and I wanted to give it a try, and it was very easy to do with this particular stamp in the background and these Distress inks. And I love what it added to this card. It's one of my favorites using these scenic stamps. I particularly love the birch trees on this scenic stamp, and then adding the city in the background was just so fun. Now I want to go back and add it to all my scenic cards and try that city in the background. Now here I'm just pressing my Distress ink pad to an old acrylic block, and I am picking up a little bit of that with water on my paintbrush because I just wanted to add a touch of that brown city color over here on the birches on the left of the card. That way the eye kind of moves from the right to the left, or the left to the right across the card, with those colors tying into each other. So you can always go back and add more color, add more painting, even once you're done stamping and you removed your card from your stamp positioning tool. I'm pressing now some of that blue that I used down at the bottom for the stamping onto the acrylic block, adding in a touch of water, and I'm going to paint the sky in a little bit. Sometimes I try to do this before I do any stamping on the background, but sometimes I don't know what my plans are and I go back in and add it later at the end like I'm doing here. And if some of your stamping blends a little bit into it or bleeds a little bit, it's fine. You're going for a watercolor look and it will be just fine. But making sure everything is dry and a little time has passed, like a minute or two since you stamped, that section will also help it not to bleed too much where you lose the detail of what you've already stamped. I felt like there was a lot of white though down at the bottom of this card, so I wanted to put a little bit of a sky color up at the top. Just going to keep blending that in, painting that over the top. And I actually decided to darken it up a little bit, so while it's still wet up there, I'm just dropping in a little bit darker color, mostly up at the corners of the sky. And now that everything is dry, I just have a blob there of white acrylic paint, and I'm going to add some snow falling onto this scene just by picking it up with my paintbrush and dabbing it onto the background. If you're brave, you can also just water down that white acrylic paint and splatter the background. To finish off this scene, I've stamped the sentiment from the Feeling of Christmas transparent set. And here is a look at that finished card. I stamped that in a nice light gray because I didn't want it to distract too much from anything happening in the scene. I sure hope you've enjoyed this video series. If you've watched all the videos, I'd love to know which card was your favorite. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, as well as Instagram, our website and blog. And everything you need to know or need a link for is down in that YouTube description box below. Happy stamping!